So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Pamela Schultz, and today we're going to be talking about automating tasks within DataGraph. We're going to start with actually some pretty simple examples, and I posted some files on the chat that I think you should be able to download. We are also, David's going to run through using the command line interface, the dgraph command line interface in DataGraph as well. And that's kind of maybe more the bigger focus that I think most of you maybe are primarily interested in, but we thought we'd start simple because really there's a lot of very simple tasks that we try to have automatic ways of importing data and processing data within the program, because there's so many tasks that are repetitive and that all of us need to do. And I guess before we get started, one of the general things that I like to tell people is if you're finding something within a task or a project that you're working on and it does seem repetitive, then you might want to just contact us, because oftentimes someone else has encountered that and we've come up with shortcuts to make that easier. Again, we're going to start with just a couple of very simple but common things that I know I use that are built into the program that you may not think completely of automation, but again, are meant to make your life easier. This is a very simple file. So I have this here within my Finder window, and I'm going to hit the space bar to give you a preview of what this file looks like. And this is a very common way that data is organized when you have a spreadsheet where you have columns of data across that have headers that are not at the top of the table. And so this would not be considered a tidy data set in that sense, because we have some other text here that's floating around where I have a title. So if I bring this into DataGraph, and let me just do a new file here, then it's very easy to just import Excel files. This is something also I like to really make people aware of, because I mean, it's not necessarily expected how easy it is. So I can just take this Excel file and drag it and drop it right over here on the left-hand side. That will create a group that imports everywhere where there are cells of data that have something in them. It will import those cells of data. And so very simply, rather than having to go and type in the column headers into each one of these columns, you can go to whatever row has the column header in it and do a right-click action, and then you'll see use row for column titles. And that just populates the column titles across the top of the DataGraph file. So again, sort of simple, but I've seen people, where you may have Excel spreadsheets that have 50 different columns of data, and you bring that in, and using the simple drag and drop is the easiest way to bring it in, rather than having to select the cells within the spreadsheet and paste them in. So here, again, I just always recommend bringing your full file in and then doing the manipulation here. And you don't have the right click action. I'm so used to saying right click. If you have David's got it on the chat. It's also a control click. So if you if you hit the control key and do a single click. So I've highlighted here, control click, the same menu will pop up, that context menu. On my computer, I actually have a laptop. Yeah, so you can do the trackpad with 2 fingers, and that will also bring this up. That's actually how I do it. But I'm a former Windows user, so I tend to still use the right-click terminology. Okay, so other thing that we can do here is we would just delete, highlight these rows. I can hit the delete key. I can also do that for the first one, since I don't need that as well, and then delete that first column. So now I have my data in the way that I'm can then now use it within DataGraph. All right, so that was the first simple example. Let's do the next one. And I'm just going to click over here to hide the group that I added from the file. And let's do test 2. Now I know I need to, I think, repost this for people. Okay, so you should have that one. I just reposted it onto the chat. Let's take this file. I'll give you maybe a moment to download that. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag it and drop it over here on the left-hand side. And I guess anyone, if you're new to the program and you haven't seen this yet, then these are grouped data groups. Instead of using tabs within spreadsheets, DataGraph has a hierarchical grouping mechanism. So you can open any of these to see the columns that are within those groups. It's one way to interact with your data. But in terms of the data table here, again, I have the same issue with this file. I guess I did not show this to you as a preview. So let's just do that very quickly, where this is another very common format that people use when they're preparing data in spreadsheets, where rather than having the, this is two columns. I have a column of label 1, a column with my data in it. And this data set really has two sections. It has, or two sets of data. It has this A data and this B data. And often I think when you're making spreadsheets, the data is organized in such a way that is nice for presentation. But in terms of data analysis, this isn't really very useful because we haven't filled in all of these additional cells stating whether or not every row is an A or a B. So in DataGraph, when you bring this in, the first thing that we can do here, again, is do the control click to use row for column titles. Let me put my keyboard on keystrokes here so you can see this. I can highlight all of the rows that I no longer need and hit the delete key. Now, here's one thing that pops up that I think when the first time you see this, if you're not used to this, can throw people off a little bit. But this is just a way to confirm whether or not you're deleting the data you really want to delete. So you have a list here on the left-hand side that shows you this. It's the same as the groups of data here, all of the columns, and the highlighted section is what will be deleted if you click this option. Only current visible columns, that's one option, or only columns in the group highlighted on the left, which is this, that option there. So here, this saying, yeah, I don't want to delete from every group. Sometimes you do. So this can be handy, but this is meant to make sure you don't mistakenly delete data you don't want to delete. So we'll just say only group. And now I want to, I can delete that column. I don't need it. And now I want to fill in each one of these, because within DataGraph, if I'm going to mask the data based on this label, filter, which is our filtering mechanism, if you're going to filter the data based on the label or have different colors depending on what these are, then you're going to want to have each row populated. And I have a shortcut for that. I can go to the top of the column, say, again, control click, fill empty rows with previous non-empty row. We've added these shortcuts because they're things that we've had to do, and now that makes your life a lot easier. And there's a number of different shortcuts for filling data in various ways. Actually, if you go to the knowledge base within the community forum, so if you go to the up here in the help button that's in the menu bar, go to the knowledge base. Let me just show you this here. And there's a one on how to fill. Here it is, how to fill a column with a series. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to make you aware that this article is here, It has some short videos that demo a bunch of different ways that you can automatically fill in. Like here, for example, this video is showing you to fill in a list of numbers. And there's a bunch more that are down here that use expressions, and a handy table here that I use a lot. Oops, didn't mean to do that, sorry. This handy table has, well, it's called advanced expressions. They're a little more complicated, but they're laid out for you so that if you, for example, wanted to generate a list like you see here for any of these, it shows you the data that you would be generating, and then it shows you the expression. Oops, sorry about that. Wow, I'm clicking in a way that I'm not mean. I'm trying to use my little highlighter things here. Click it. Here's the expression you'd use in a column to generate the example that you see here. Anyway, I find this to be very handy. I come back to this table quite often. So let's go back to the file that you have. I don't think there's anything else I want to say about this one. So the two examples we've done are ways, again, of automating a task that may be repetitive in terms of filling the data or manipulating the data. Oh, and that is actually one more thing I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of. In the knowledge base, sorry to go back and forth a little bit here, but there is a whole section in the how-to tutorials on working with data. That has a bunch of other examples of things that are like some automated ways of manipulating data that I think is worth looking at the articles that are there. Anyway, okay, so the next example is looking at now when you have a data set that you want to bring in, but you have to do some manipulation. For example, what we did with setting the header, and you don't want to have to do it over and over again. This is what we call an automated method to bring in data, and we use what's called an import special method. So if you go under, let's see, oh, actually, I wanted to let me give you the files to do this. Close this one. And I do have to do this kind of one at a time for everyone. So let me just share these. So anyway, so the import special method, if you've never used this before, this is a method that allows you to create a custom parsing method for bringing in sets of data in one or more files. So the first example that I did today was an example where you had a relatively simple file, but you had to find where the header row was, use that row for the column headers, and there was some other data, that column that you didn't need also that was deleted. If you have to do that just once, that's not that big of a deal. But what if you had hundreds of files that had a simple format like that you needed to bring in? That would become very repetitive and is not something we want to spend our time on. And that's why we came up with this import special method. And what I've shared with you now on the chat are 3 CSV files. To preview these here, again, I can hit the space bar. Well, let me do all 3 at once. No, it won't. I can only show you one at a time. But these all have the same format. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I shared the first one twice. Thank you for pointing that out to me. Let me share this again. Okay. Okay, now you should have it. I should probably give you a moment to download those files. Excellent. So ideally you would have those files in the same folder, those 3 CSV files. And And they all have the same exact format where you have this title, you have a label column, and you have a column 2 and 3 here. Actually, maybe as I was preparing these there. No, they're all the same. I guess this could have been column 1. Anyway, so I have had this type of a project before where I've had just, files that are automatically generated from an instrument, for example, and they always have the same format. This is a very simple example. The import special can do a lot more complicated things than this, but just to give you a simple test to run through how this works and to have you try this out. So first of all, I would go into DataGraph and I'm going to say data, and notice there are some other import options here, but I'm going to use the import special. Actually, you can also, I think, access this from the gear menu here where it says import special. A quick comment too, that there are these other import file options here. For pretty much any file that DataGraph can take in, you can just use that drag and drop I did earlier. So I rarely use these options, even though you can do that and select a file to import. Anyway, so let's go ahead and select import special. And the first thing it's going to ask me to do is select which file I want to import. And I can go ahead and select one or multiple files. So I'll just go ahead now because I know all 3 of these files are what I want to import. I'll go ahead and highlight all of them and say open. That brings up a new interface. So if you're trying this out, maybe I'll just give everyone a moment, hopefully, to get to the point where they see essentially what I'm showing here. Let me also make this a little bit. I think I can expand this out a little. There we go. So the way that this works is that when you're opening the import special interface, you get a preview of the raw underlying data. And that's what you see here. And this will show you a preview where you can also change which file is being shown. So if you notice, the data will change as you click through the file. So you can preview what different files look like. But what I want to do here is come up with a set of instructions visually with this interface as to how this data should be interpreted. And there are a number of different sections that allow you to create this. And the first one that you see is related to a header definition where you can bring in a header or you can find where basically the data begins. Is one way. If there's a keyword that you can search for, that's what this icon refers to. What I'm going to do is actually just skip some of the lines. So I can click this button and then it adds an object that represents the action of skipping some number of lines. And I can use the slider to increase the number of lines I'm skipping. Now, you're not seeing too much go on yet, so let me continue first. In the next section has this stop parsing. I actually don't need to do anything about that for this file. This is if you wanted to stop moving through the file at some point in the middle. This file also does not have a subheader, but you can have sections of data. Again, it's a little bit more complicated, but we'll stick with the simple version for now. So what we're going to do is use this section here where we have the record definition, and these icons for DataGraph users should look familiar. You see one that looks like a number column, one that looks like a text column, and one that looks like the date column. And these are clickable. And when you click them, you will get an object created. And you may have noticed that down here, you also now see a row number. Now I'm going to click this again. Oh, and it's subtle, but the first column in this data actually is blank, which is why there's a column here, but you don't see anything in it. Let's add another number column. Now you're seeing the data and you're seeing it in this tabular format. And you're also seeing the preview get highlighted to correspond to this column that's being imported. I'll click it one more time and then again. And so the alternating colors in this view help to just differentiate the different columns from one to another. And then here it's showing you what it will look like based on the instructions you've given it so far in DataGraph. There's a similar way to populate the column headers. So each one of these objects here will have, actually my mouse is not clicking, there. So now you can maybe see this a little better. Each one of these objects has a place to enter a name. We already have a name here we want to use. So there's a shortcut built in. If I control click here, I can use the row for my titles. That gets populated. And then I can uncheck this, whether or not I populate that first row. Now, if you notice, when I skip the lines of data, when I change this setting, then it will interactively change where the number of lines being skipped, and I can specify that I want the top 7 lines being skipped. And if I now just want to import this data, I'll click on the import button here. And now that all that data has been imported and appended to each other. Now, there's one thing I didn't do that actually is very handy, because right now you can't necessarily tell, although the 1 to 8, starts in the left-hand column. But what's also very helpful is to actually have the name of the files be now a label, a text column within your DataGraph file. So let me actually just highlight this. I'll uncheck just to hide this from the data table. And now let's do import special one more time on the same data. I can highlight this again. And what you'll, first of all, I want you to notice is I don't have to recreate all those settings. The settings that I just used will be saved. You can have them saved within just this file. So I can just save these settings. And you can also make them global. If you go into the help documentation for the import special, it will talk about all this. So I won't go into that detail. But what I just want to show you is how you can include the file name as a column. And now when I import this data, you'll see how there's a column with file name and it's again alternating depending on each of these. So I could use that to filter my data or however I wanted to use it. Okay, David is reminding me I should probably we should go now to the next part, which is the command line interface, and let him go ahead, and he's going to walk you through some examples of bringing data in at the command line and creating graphs. And David, are you?
So what we're going to do is pile in two, because the DataGraph command line utility that comes embedded inside the DataGraph application. So if you go into, and I'm going to just do this from the terminal because that's going to be sort of where we're going to live, is that if you go into applications and DataGraph app here, DataGraph is really a folder, right? That's how all applications are. And it has, inside that there's contents, inside that there's library. And inside that, if you do a listing of the library content, you see here dgraph. Now, if you launch dgraph, you normally do that with a help. And like just to start, you can see like some help documents on that. So that's how, because a lot of the sort of command line utilities, you have to kind of get used to kind of their quirkiness in terms of how their argument list is. And the standard way is to do either a man page or a help or question mark. I think the question mark is also same thing will happen to kind of get some listing. And if you want more information, you can do like help, sort of go back into DataGraph and say, sort of help with output. And oops, I forgot the minus sign. Otherwise, it just tries to open that up. you can sort of see more help information. So there's a few screens there you can sort of navigate through, and there's also things on the discussion, on the resource board. Now, here I have a folder that I'm going to start living in. So I'm going to cd into that folder, right? Go into that folder here, where I have currently a template for testing purposes, but I'm going to create a new one. And the first thing to do is you can certainly type in the name of the content library dgraph. That's fairly long. So what instead I want to do is to make, for example, a symbolic link to it. So this is, so ln-s is create a symbolic link from this directory here to the current directory, which is now you have a dgraph here. You always have to, if it's running something locally, you have to say dgraph and then -help to run it, because just writing dgraph is not going to work. There's a security precaution in the system. So that's an old security flaw that Unix had decades ago. So anyway, or what you can also do is to, if you have a bin folder here, and that bin folder is in your search path, then you can do, like I have a utility that I use for creating disk images that I just have inside my bin directory, and bin is in the search path, but that's another way of doing it. So I'm going to start all of my commands here with dgraph, and then as you can see, they really are that you have to hand in the script, you have to the output, and you have like the file name, you have to hand in data that you want to import, what the template name is, and what you want to get out. So let's create a template just to sort of walk through that step. In here, let me just go through the online examples. I'm going to open up here as the second template up as to create this template, just because there's a bunch of X and Y files, and I have some calculations. So you can sort of see, if you look at the structure of this, there's a raw, this one here is all computed. That's why there's an FX in here. I'm going to select the two columns and make them into a number column so that I just convert them into raw data files, and I can save this into temp, like so, say script, right? So now it's also a script in here.
David, maybe
Yep.
just show them in this, how that slider, just for anyone who hasn't used this.
Yeah, so the
template
slider here is, this script works that you can vary the size of this. This N here is being used here dynamically inside this token field here to show this, and inside the mask for this, and it's in here, N is being used. So you just limit your points to anything that is either above the current N value or to the right of the current N value. So if you change the N value, things are dynamically changing. And you can do that either in a rectangle or inside an oval, and that you can, and that's a different mask here, right? Where you compute the distance using an expression, which is just the expression, the norm, which is the sum of the squares square root. And that has to be bigger than N. So it's a radius N in the sort of radius N, above, outside of radius N in the XY plane. So there's a raised hand, but okay, so maybe Pamela, you can sort of relay the question to me. So anyway, so what I want to do is to kind of use this as a sample, sort of let me see, what do I want to, Pamela, there's something on the chat. Okay, so maybe you can move this over to the chat question. Pamela can read it and then sort of relay the question to me. So anyway, so I have here the data set, and I'm going to export this out because this is sort of an interesting data set. I'm going to export the data into some file. So this is the data file, right? And I export that out, and now I have a data file.txt in the same demo folder. And now what I will do is that I'm going to select all the rows, not these columns, but the rows, hit delete, right? That deletes the data selection, or I can just take all but the first here to the bottom, delete that. I have very few points left, but I have some. And what I want to automate, and the data graph is working as automating an action that you can otherwise do in DataGraph. And the action that it automates is the following. You select the columns, and in this case, all the columns that are visible, and you go in and you drag that data file from here onto the table. Not here, because that would import them as additional columns, but here to overwrite the content. And that will overwrite it here, and the graph will update, right? This is one way of automating inputting different data in DataGraph. And this action here is very quickly updates everything with all the calculations, and all the graphs are updated. So dgraph is automating this action. And the way that it does that is that you type into DataGraph the components you want. You need, yes, it says like script path name dash output, but if there's no ambiguity, you don't have to give the script name and the output name that is sort of obvious by context. So if you take this, and let me just move things around a little bit so that I can see this. I have, and it doesn't matter what order it is, I have the data file that I want to import. I have the script name that I have to import. Now, DataGraph files are folders, so let's just delete that last folder thing here. And so that's the script name, and then I have to specify what I want out. So let's say that I just want out.pdf. That's the file that I want to export out. Now, when I hit return, DataGraph is launched, but without a graphical user interface. It's not using DataGraph that is currently running. It launches another copy of it. It does not, however, bring up any user interface for that copy. So it will go through and really on your behalf, select all the columns that are visible. Any things that are hidden are not selected. Then it will override that selection with the data file.txt content. And then once it's done, it sees this out.pdf, and it will export the current graph, in this case, the oval, to that file. So let's just launch that, and it's done. So now your out.pdf, if you hit, that's the file here. If you go in and select the rectangle and hit save, and do the same thing with just an out2.png, for example, now you have an out.png, and that's this. Now, this is a very low resolution. I don't know if this shows through the Zoom session, but this is a this is a standard resolution of it. It's a 72 dpi. If you want a higher definition, there's another flag for that. So dpi 600, and hit return, and that overwrites it. So now your file is much higher resolution. Now, if you can also do a different format, which is say the SVG format, and then this file here, now you have to drag that into say the browser to see what it is, and that's this file here, right? So this here is not updating the distance, because that cannot be overwritten. So the fact that it's visible doesn't hurt it, because it's not going to overwrite that data set. If this was not visible, it would do the wrong thing, because if this was not visible, meaning like this, and you saved it, and you imported the same thing here, and opened the out.png, there's a lot fewer. Because really, it overwrote the X, it added, but it was not used a Y column after that, and it didn't modify the distance, right? You don't see that, but that's sort of what happens. So one way to view this is that if your dgraph argument dgraph call doesn't quite do what you intend to do, you can always just repeat the process manually, saying like, I'm just over selecting everything, dragging this, and then making these changes. Any question, Pamela? Because
No, I know.
there was a
the
raised
command line-
hand, and please
Yeah,
sort of
it's just, I think
send
it's just
that
a,
to the chat.
it's just a leftover. No, there's no
Oh, okay,
questions right
fine.
now.
So let me now tweak this. So this is the simplest way of doing things. You can also do the other one, which is, if you look at here, there is the flagged option. So if I create, for example, make there out, I'm creating a new directory, out, and now I add in as an argument here, flagged, as I'm basically going by this, and I'm doing out, and I have format, because if I do this just alone, that you can sort of see that that jumped up a little bit, but it didn't. So but now if you look at the out folder, that shows now both of the flagged options. So this is a way if you want to save more than one, because if you don't specify anything, you just specify the output name, it takes the current graph. If you want more than that or other graphs, you use the flagging mechanism to flag what you want to output, and you can get this. Now let me delete this thing here because I want to try another one, which is if I looked at, I can say format, I can do a comma separated list. So I can say PNG, comma, SVG, and DPI should be 600. And then what happens is that both a PNG and a SVG format is created on it, and the PNG is a 600 DPI PNG. So if you're doing scripting that you want to create multiple versions of it, certainly you can do that this way in just one call. If you want the multiple resolutions, you have to call this call dgraph again, because the format statement is not a comma separated list.
David,
So,
I have one question for you.
Yep.
Is there a way to specify which plot you want to output from the command line?
No, well, you do that by, that is not yet a option, because these graphs don't really have names. Well, they have names, but those don't have to be unique. There's not an option here for now to do that, but that's something that people want. We definitely are always interested in getting feedback and suggestions. For example, a recent feedback, and this works in the latest version, meaning the beta, but not the released version, is that someone wanted to import Excel files that way. So that was added, and there you can specify what sheet you want to import. So those things are being added as use cases come up, and that will then be documented in here in the help documents, and it should be. And so but there's not specify a different graph to do it. And partly it's because the more arguments you have, the harder it is to understand kind of what is it and why doesn't it do what I wanted to do. So the argument list is supposed to be somewhat obvious and readable. The one thing that I want to do though, is that you can have, for example, the n value. Let's make this into a value n rather than being a slider. I want this to be a value, and I can sort of make just to sort of preview it, because you can preview what you are doing here. And let me do a text that is title and my title. And let me add a token for this title here. So now you can preview the graph, save it. And then if you go in here, and let me just go back into a simple output 3.png, but I will now have v, or short for variable, like you can see I'm doing this, minus v, name is equal to value. So I can say like title is equal to new title. And that, if I now look at the output 3, that's now incorporated into it. N is still 1.5. So if I then say minus v, n is equal to 2.1, and I'm overriding the 2.1. So you can you can override a few variables as part of the input using arguments. So that was kind of a quick, again, I wanted to have some time for questions and answers, but this here is then the command line argument that this is really the name, this is the command, this is the dgraph application run from the console, and this here, this argument list here is how you kind of handed inputs. And really the point is automating the process of opening the file. Oh, what is this? Am I not? Power saver. I'm automating the process of opening the DataGraph file, selecting all the columns, dragging the file that you're handing in this case, datafile.txt. And if it doesn't have a name that it can detect, then you need to say then it needs to be in the beginning, right? Because it's, well, actually, if anything that is not a dgraph or a known graphical ending can be just read. So I stand corrected. You don't have to specify it in any particular order, but it's typically in the beginning. And then either sort of exports the output and then quits. It doesn't stay on. There is a way to have it stay on. If you leave out the output, then what happens, and you can sort of see it's opening another copy of it. It opens up, instead of exporting it, it leaves itself open. So that's what really, so this is one way of seeing what happened if I did, since I didn't have, I forgot to unhide the Y button. That's the reason why this was broken, is if I leave out the output setting, because I left out this, it does that and then opens the file rather than kind of like sort of closing itself up. And this is why I have now 2 copies of DataGraph running. This is a doc issue. I don't know why that happened. So anyway, so that's sort of now this can then be used from variety of places, right? One thing is you can have a shell script, like a bash script, where this is just in one of the lines. So you have a line that imports it. So I mean, here, for example, let me just fix this. So this is an untitled, so this is not the actual document. I'll show this so that I have the full data. I will have the script and output is the output.svg, and then this here creates the output.svg, and now I can say scp output.svg to.
David, I do have a question. Oh, there's a question on the chat.
And I wanted to, so that takes a little bit of time. Go in here and say outp.svg, and I have the graph here. So now you could sort of chain together the dgraph command and a scp command to secure copy it onto another site, so that you can automate updating websites, for example.
That's neat. That's really neat. So there's a question. Can you preview the datafile.txt again? And does because I think the larger question, does the DataGraph command line interface replace the data based on the column placement, or does it try to match the column header?
No, it does not look at the header. It's just really the order that you have in, right? So it takes the file, and let me just quit this guy here, right? It takes the file and really effectively selects everything and then copies it over. So whatever happens when you drag the file over the selection is what dgraph will do. Nothing else. There's no special import. There's no kind of trying to merge things. It's just, so the structure of your data file needs to be similar, look the same as this. Now, the reason this, however, you can move this, even though it doesn't make sense, over to the second column, and you can import over, because importing over those two, over those three, let me just sort of see what happens here. If you drag over, it imports over the X column, skips over this column because it's not editable, and imports over this one. So you don't have to worry about kind of what happens to sort of, I mean, the order is important, but it will skip over things that are not editable. So
yeah, no, that's good. I was posting online a link to the YouTube channel for DataGraph where this video will be posted, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Someone was asking, how did you create the script file? But I don't know, is this is really, I think you're doing everything just from the command line right now. Is that correct?
I'm just doing everything from a command line. So if you, I mean, you can certainly go in and CD into this and then say Emacs sort of runs. To say, to flag to save all images from the file rather than just the flagged ones. Right? Yeah, that's. I mean, this one here.
Well, I think you can save everything, right? If they're flagged.
Yeah, if they're flagged.
Maybe you should just point out what you mean by flagged.
So you see these two flags. When I exported this out with the flag.
Show how on the thumbnails you flag a graph.
Yeah, so if you go in, there's a flag here in the top corner. So if you go over something that is not flagged, there's a button here that you can flag it, and then it leaves over. So that flag is used in a number of places. For example,
that works.
You can say export flag graphs and so forth. And that is how you can, and that mechanism is what this goes into when you say minus flag. I sort of chose that rather than all, because often graphs are composited. I mean, if you have more than one, you might have 50 or 10 of them, but really many of them are kind of used in a final composite. Right? So there's certainly an option. I mean, that the option for minus all, right, could be so that you don't even have to worry about flagging them beforehand. And certainly if you say like
that sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
Right? Another option, just like thinking of like things that could be done, is to specify the name of that. Right? So like minus out, like some flag that I have to think about, that you specify what flag, what file, like which of these do you want to compute, and then it has to be matching the name of this. So there's a whole bunch of things that could be done. But often with with command line utilities, if you look at any of the old command line utilities, the man page is massive. So there's a little bit of kind of let's grow in a way that people kind of will use. So, but yeah, I'm definitely open to suggestions on that. So what some people do is that these calls are just system calls. You can have what I wanted to do was to say, like, I can make this here, paste it in, and copy this and paste that in. Oops. I have to go into and then save this, and then I can say source runs, and it will do both of them for me. So that's one way that you can combine into what's called a sort of a script. And I'm just doing like sourcing it will just execute those lines. You can also set it up as a bash script to then run it this so that you can say, at the moment you can't do runs because it's not really an executable yet, but you can make it so that dot runs will run these two lines. What some have done is that Python allows you to call a system call. And this is a system call really. So meaning calling into the system to execute a certain command. So what some people do is that they have their Python logic would be, they set up their data, then they save it to a text file using pandas for that. into, say, some temporary working directory, then run the dgraph command with that file name and another output file in, again, the same temporary directory. And then they can read that, like then, so there's two system calls in Python, one, right? They have one that is just Python call to save it, one system call to run dgraph, then a Python call to, say, read the output. And then they can iterate on that, do some logic on that. And that is preferable than trying to make DataGraph have a scripting language. The world does not really need one more specific scripting language. And that's how I intend to kind of like be able to reuse this, is being called easily from either the terminal scripts or Python scripts or other scripts that know how to call scripts. There is another scripting environment, but it's still in the beta, right? So if you go into, if you look at ls -l applications, DataGraph, you look at the levels that there's a dgraph and there's a dgraph connect, and that is very much kind of in the very early development stages, and that allows you to connect to a DataGraph application that is currently running. So you can modify, I mean, the idea is that you can have a DataGraph file that you have on, like, in here, and dgraph connect connects to DataGraph and then issues commands and imports data and modifies things and so forth for you. That is a little unwieldy, but if people are interested in that type of a mechanism, that's a more fine-grained than a one-shot like command line thing. It's more of a connection through sockets or streams. Then contact me and I will sort of, but it's at the moment it's a little bit early in the development. So
there are some, there's a section on the knowledge base that has some documentation on both dgraph and dgraph connect, and I'll put that right now on the chat. A link to
otherwise
that.
I'm sort of
Those articles. So I think we're in good shape, and thanks so much, everyone. I was going to show you a little someone. I don't know, David, if you can make me the host again for a moment. So for those of you who are still here, this is Mia, and she was making a little bit of noise. Yes, this is new puppy. So if you go on my Twitter feed is @PamsData. I have a plot of her growth, and that I need to also update because every week we're weighing her in grams and and keeping track of that. So anyway, thanks everyone so much. She's a little fussy right now, so I'm going to take her out, and it's great seeing everyone on the chat, and we'll look forward to the next time. I guess we don't have a specific idea for our next webinar, but we'll be working on that. And in the meantime, contact us on the help or send us an email.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.